Hi, Katrina. Nice to have you with us. I think we will make a start as other people are continuing to join us. And I'll begin just by saying I'm Joanna Santa Barbara, even though my image says Jack. He's in the background. And I'm the co-chair of Nelson Tasman Climate Forum. I'll begin with a karakia, whose intent is for this gathering, seek knowledge for understanding, have purpose in all you do, stand tall, be strong, let's show respect for each other. E te whānau hui, whaia te mātauranga kia marama. Kia whai take ngā mahi katoa. Tū maia, tū kaha. Aroha atu, aroha mai. Tato kia tato katoa. So welcome everyone. And as our karakia says, seek knowledge for understanding to fulfill our purpose. And our purpose is to draw people together for urgent action in all the ways that it matters. And one of these ways that really matters is agricultural emissions, responsible for half or more of New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions. And it's a relatively untouched area by the forum, but I want to mention some of how people in the forum have engaged with these matters. Early this year, we had a presentation by Mike Joy on the future of food and energy. And this was quite an iconoclastic presentation intended to bust what Mike called fairy tales that we can just substitute EVs, renewable energy, and minimal demands on agriculture to change our food systems and continue as before. He pointed out in that talk that our food systems, especially intensive dairy, use far more energy, mainly fossil fuel, than they produce in food energy. And they result in having some of the most nitrogen polluted rivers in the world, with consequent loss of species and possibly human health. And that they degrade and erode soil, as well as contributing more than half our greenhouse gas emissions. He believes industrial agriculture should pay the full costs of all their emissions, thus necessarily transforming food production. He advocates localized food systems with no external inputs, no emissions, no monocultures, and producing more food energy than they consume in energy inputs. He sees changing landscapes as mixed permaculture farms replace industrial farms, reviving and expanding rural communities. Now, this was quite hard for some people to listen to, understandably, though it was based on verifiable data. However, the forum has had for some time, in fact, from its early days, 2.5 years ago, people working on just such food systems, community gardens, productive home gardens, composting, seed saving, and so on. In fact, our speaker tonight, Jessica, was involved in the early days of the forum in the food system group. This action sector was boosted in the middle of this year during our Climate Action Week by the visit and film of the work of Julia Milne of Common Unity in Wellington, and in itself is community building. It's an essential part of another area of forum work, which is beginning to take its important role, and that's adaptation to climate change and energy scarcity, and their impact on growing food and on food supply chains. We're already seeing aspects of the supply chain impact play out in extremely adverse ways in countries dependent on Russian gas, Ukrainian oil, and wheat. So this is a big picture. This is the big picture of food systems in transition. Now we focus down on current forms of agriculture in Aotearoa and their part in our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. And the timing of this is very good. We have in hand the government's consultation document on agricultural emissions pricing, and some of us are working on this right now. We need to respond as climate-aware citizens and to give an informed opinion on this matter. And Jessica Bensemann is very highly qualified to help us do this. I'm delighted to introduce to you Jessica, and thank you, Jessica, for being with us. And let me note again that Jessica was with us in the early days of the forum. She grew up on a sheep and beef farm in Te Tauihu and is a member of one of the oldest families in this region. Jessica qualified with a master's degree in agri-commerce, agribusiness, and went on to become an agricultural analyst for Beef and Lamb New Zealand. Jessica used her award of the prestigious Nuffield Scholarship to work on the direction of New Zealand's primary industries in a globalizing world. She did some work which I imagine was extremely interesting on women in agricultural co-ops in Papua New Guinea, and then went on to a role with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade in agricultural aid economics. Jessica was economic portfolio manager for Nelson City Council until last year, and now has the title of Kaitatari Mātamua in a Waka Eke Noa team in the Ministry for the Environment. Now, I had to go and look up what Kaitakari meant, and the Te Aka dictionary tells me it is a sifter of data. Mātamua means elder or firstborn or principal, so Jessica is the principal analyst on these issues for the He Waka Eke Noa team in the Ministry for the Environment. She has therefore been wrestling at close quarters with this monster problem of reducing agricultural emissions in response to the threats of climate change. We could hardly have a better person to help us in our understanding of this very difficult problem. So before I pass over to Jessica almost immediately, let me just mention that the first bit of our Q&A period will be on questions of clarification. So if there are terms or relationships or mechanisms that you would like more explanation of as Jessica proceeds, note them down and we'll deal with those first in the question period before we get on to questions of substance. I won't be checking the chat box, so note them down and put up your hand when it comes to the question period. So very happy to pass over to Jessica now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Joanna. And yeah, it is a pleasure to be here. Having joined, as you said, with the forum when it first began, and I have wanted to continue my involvement, but as you said, over this last year, trying to work through this policy challenge has been kind of my primary focus in the climate space. And yeah, it is a pleasure to be able to share some of that experience with you all today and hear your thoughts on it as well. Partly, I reached out to Joanna to do this presentation because I do really want, I think this forum is a unique and really valuable resource to provide things like feedback to government on certain policy areas, and I want to make sure that you guys have a good chance to provide an informed submission and to be able to answer any questions that you might have in that process. So I will share my screen and run through a bit of a presentation. If any of you have attended one of the public webinars that have been happening over the last couple of weeks and will be carrying on, there are still some public webinars to come. It will be a similar presentation. But I hope through this format we can at the end get into the detail and perhaps have a bit more of an informal conversation about it, so that it's not as much of a formal process as the government public webinars will be. So I'll just share my screen. And so yes, can everybody see that? Cool. Could I just ask, can everybody go on mute? Just there is a little bit of background noise from perhaps from some of the other participants in the group. Thank you. Cool. So as Joanna said, we are in the middle of the public consultation process for Waka Eke Noa, which is the project seeking to determine how agricultural emissions will be priced. And it does certainly feel like this is a bit of a momentous point in time that we are, getting down to the real nitty-gritty about how this is going to work. But this has been a long process to get here, and there will be some that will be very familiar with when the pricing of agricultural emissions was first raised, sort of back in 2002, 2003, and there were the protests then at that stage about pricing agricultural emissions and farmers' response to that at that time. And here we are, almost 20 years later, still grappling with this conversation because it is a really sensitive one. You would have seen in the media that this is, and the Prime Minister has said, we are one of the first countries in the world to do this. I was involved in a conversation with OECD countries a couple of months ago, presenting about New Zealand's process going through this, and other countries, the UK, Europe, etc., are starting to look at this and really thinking about how this could apply in their own countries, but they're right at the beginning of that conversation. And the reason for that is because agricultural production and food production is such a sensitive topic, both from the point of view of providing livelihoods and economic growth and development from the agriculture sector, and what that means for economies, but also for food security, because farmers are involved in producing food that feeds people all over the world, and we have very globalized, interconnected food supply chains, and it is extremely politically sensitive to put any additional cost on that sector through an emissions price. So yeah, so this is very frontier stuff for policy development, and as we go through it, you'll get to understand some of the complexity involved in it. So what I will cover today, a bit of background about how we got here and why this policy is being progressed at this point in time, and the importance of it to the New Zealand government at the moment. I will talk through what is involved and included in the government's proposal that we are consulting on at the moment, and how that relates to the Waka Eke Noa partnership proposal, and I can explain that, and also advice we got from the Climate Change Commission. And then I'll run through some of the components of the pricing system that we are particularly seeking feedback on through this consultation. and then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. So this, I wondered if I needed to cover off some of this stuff, because obviously you guys are very familiar and intimately aware of the impact of climate change and the need for us to act. But this is, you know, kind of our opening context for why we are looking at pricing emissions, is that we do recognise as a globe, and definitely in New Zealand, we have made declarations that are, you know, put commitments on us as a country to take action and to take as much action as we can as quickly as possible, because we are seeing, you know, more and more frequently the impact of climate change on our communities and on the nature around us. So that is some of the context for this. And more specifically for New Zealand and for us to play a role in reducing emissions globally, we have quite a unique emission profile where, given that we have quite a landmass and not many people, and we use that land for producing food from livestock, we have 50% of our emissions coming from agriculture. And most of those emissions are coming from the animals themselves, as well as the fertilizer that is applied to produce grass for our animals to eat. And so there has been, since 1990, an increase in our emissions from agriculture. They've gone up around 17%. And that has predominantly come about through an increase in the national dairy herd and application of nitrogen fertilizer. And so we have seen a slight reduction in emissions from the sheep, beef and deer sector. So we have legislated through the Climate Change Response Act that we will reduce our biogenic methane emissions by 10% from the 2017 levels by 2030, and that those emissions will decrease between a range of 24 to 47% by 2050. And so those are the current targets that we are working towards, and kind of the objective that we're aiming towards with agricultural emissions pricing. We also have a net zero for long-lived gases by 2050. And then, so those are our domestic targets. We also have, through our NDC, our nationally determined contribution, which is our international commitment, that we will reduce our emissions 50% by 2030 from 2005 levels. So it is a bit of a complicated landscape where we do have different emissions reductions targets domestically and internationally. And we also have emissions budgets as well that we have set for sectors, specific sectors, through our emissions reduction plan. So we have to find a way that pricing can support us to achieve the targets, our budgets, concurrently. So this is the short history of agricultural emissions pricing. So in 2019, the Interim Climate Change Commission produced a report recommending the best way for agricultural emissions to be priced. And they said that agriculture should go in the ETS as soon as possible, and that it should transition to a farm level pricing system by 2025. And in response to that, the agriculture sector, through the Food and Fibre Leaders Forum, put a proposal to government and said, look, we acknowledge that there is a need for pricing of agricultural emissions, but rather than putting us in the ETS, work with us to design what a farm level pricing system should look like. And the government went out to consult on that, and back in 2019, and again, some of you might have been involved in submission processes back then, and it was agreed following that consultation that the government would work together with the sector and iwi Māori to design what that pricing system should look like, and would delay agriculture going into the ETS on the basis of designing that system together. So from then, over the last 2 years, the government, through the Ministry for Primary Industries and MFE, Ministry for Environment, has worked together with 13 sector partners and the Federation of Māori Authorities to design how that system should look. And so again, bearing in mind that no one in the world has done this before, we had to start with a blank piece of paper and think about what that system should look like. And so the work program was split into different areas, different work streams. So one group was looking at specifically how the price should work. Another group looked at how would farmers need to report their emissions and how does that process work. And another group looked at how could farmers be rewarded for sequestration. And so that was a real process of collaboration and negotiation, trying to get all of those sector partners, 13 sector partners, to agree on how it could work, and then also agree with government partners. And so in May this year, they provided their report to government, and there were things in that report that government partners had said that that they could not fully support. And these were areas where perhaps the sector wanted things to operate in a particular way, and government knew that to actually put that into practice from an operational perspective, it wouldn't be possible for government to do that. And so there were some aspects of that recommendation report that at the time government said we can't fully support. And you will see that comes through in some of the recommendations that we have made in the consultation that we've gone out with. This year, we've also had 2 reports come from the Climate Change Commission. And they were legislated reports for the Commission to provide advice to government. And that was, one of those was on the progress towards farmer readiness for emissions pricing. So we recognise that putting 20 to 30,000 farmers and growers into an emission pricing scheme is going to be really complicated, and that if farmers are going to face a price, they need to be have the awareness and understanding and education and support to be able to respond to that price. And so the commission provided advice that they thought that farmers could be ready by 2025 for an emissions price if it is quite a basic price, and so not a complicated design. And we also recognise from government's point of view that it's going to be quite challenging for us to get an emissions pricing scheme in place by 2025, and so we will be seeking a simple system as much as possible. At the end of this year, ministers have to publish a report which will provide an outline of what an alternative pricing system could look like to the ETS. So we have to get most of the design done by the end of this year, and then Cabinet will make final decisions on that pricing system early next year for us to then shift into the implementation phase through to 2025. So what we have gone out to consult on is a modified version of what the partnership proposed to us in earlier this year. So we've agreed with the partnership that we think we support a farm level levy, and that will be a split price levy, so that there will be a separate price for long-lived and short-lived gases. some of the original advice from the Commission was that it should be more of a it should be more of a price that reflects the market in a similar way that the ETS does. But the partnership struggled to come up with a way to be able to do that. And so that is why we've ended up with a simple levy system, which is not a market-based price, but is where the price is determined by a particular person, and we recommend that that will be ministers. So it's not a market price like the ETS, but it is a levy in a similar way that farmers are levied for other purposes, or we are levied for ACC levies or things like that. And that the revenue from that levy will be used to support additional emissions reductions. Because it is not designed as a price to do that inherently within the price. So we need to have additional functions that then incentivize those greater emission reductions. We recognize that it's going to be extremely challenging to get emissions pricing set up at farm level by 2025. And so we want to have a processor level levy as a backstop in case that system can't be up and running. And that is because government has committed to ensure that agriculture emissions are priced by 2025. And so we don't want to delay it any further if we can't get the farm level system up and running. We also, government has committed that farmers will be recognised for sequestration, additional sequestration for on-farm vegetation, other than what is recognised within the emissions trading scheme at the moment. And that will, in the short term, be done through a kind of a grant contractual system, but government considers that in the long term, sequestration should occur through be rewarded through the ETS. And as I said, we're also seeking feedback on options for the pricing for nitrogen fertilizer. Okay, so getting into the detail of how a farm level levy will work. So there are a number of decisions that have to be made around that, and that's some of the things that we are consulting on through this consultation. And so first of all, we need to determine who is legally responsible to pay the levy, at what are the thresholds there, and who is the legal person who needs to pay. How will emissions be reported and calculated to determine how much a farmer has to pay? Who will set the price, and how does that process work? And how can farmers be rewarded for reducing emissions on farm or for carbon sequestration on farm? And then, because it is a levy, as I said, we also need to determine policy around what that levy revenue will be used for. So to start with, who is going to have to report and pay? So government has agreed with a partnership in this area. So we agree with the thresholds that were determined through the partnership, that it will be GST registered farmers and growers at the business owner perspective, which meet these thresholds here. And the rationale for those thresholds was that they represent, I think, around 95 or 96% of agricultural emissions if we capture it at that level. And we've gone with the business owner, so that is, it could be the leaseholder rather than the landowner, because we want to ensure that the people that are being priced are the ones that can actually make change on farm. So what what needs to happen, because we can't directly measure emissions that are actually coming from individual farms, we have to estimate those through a calculator. And there are a number of ways that you can do this. But it comes with, the more detail that you put in, it comes with more, it will be more accurate for measuring the emissions on farm, but it also comes at a higher administrative cost and information requirement. And the partnership recommended, and we agree, that to start with, we will just use a simple calculator. And so that captures as much as possible at a high level the volume of emissions coming from a farm. And so what we'll be seeking is things like the stock reconciliation, which will measure what are the number of animals on a farm month by month throughout the year. What's the application of nitrogen fertilizer on the farm throughout the year? And then from that, those figures are then put into a centrally organized and managed calculator. So at the moment, there are a number of different calculators out there that farmers can put their numbers into, and they might give you different numbers. And so we want to make sure that we have a centralized calculator that standardizes these things across all farms. And then from that, the farmers will get a number for their kgs of methane produced on farm, and also for long-lived gases, so for nitrous oxide. And so from that, from those different volumes of short-lived and long-lived gases, that will be multiplied by a price, so a methane price and a long-lived gas price. And so those two numbers together will be your levy payment. And we are including, and I'll go into more detail on this, an opportunity to have your emissions bill reduced by uptaking particular mitigations on farm. And you can also have an opportunity for a sequestration payment in the short term to be taken off your levy payment as well. So going into detail of the incentive payments. So the reason for including a component for incentive payments is because we're not seeing a really strong direct price incentive from a levy price, other than to just reduce stock numbers. So we want to try and design like a marginal incentive for farmers to carry out particular practices or introduce particular technologies. And so what is proposed, and this was proposed by the partnership as well, is that farmers can be rewarded for introducing particular technologies or practices that will reduce their emissions. And so what will happen is that they will be rewarded at a higher price per tonne of methane or nitrous oxide reduced than they would have to pay for it. So you would see an additional benefit from taking up technologies. And so those could be things like there will be an approved list that farmers will be able to tick a box to say, yes, I have applied a nitrification inhibitor, or I have low methane sheep genetics, or I have used a particular feed additive that reduces emissions. And then they will automatically have an amount taken off their levy bill. This is a difference. The way that we are proposing to reward sequestration is a difference from the partnership's proposal. So the partnership had proposed that, like the incentive payment, sequestration would be taken off their emissions bill directly. So a farmer would calculate their long-lived gas and short-lived gas levy rates, and then incentive payments and sequestration payments will be taken off that. The government has proposed that there is a bit of a difference here, and partly that is because ministers have proposed and agreed in principle that the New Zealand emissions trading scheme is where in the long term on-farm vegetation should be rewarded. And so because of that, because that is seen as the long-term option, a short-term interim option is proposed for 2025, which will be a separate system. And this was recommended by the Climate Commission as well, because the advice from the Commission was that including it within the levy payment would add complexity to the system that may delay its implementation. It also raised some equity issues because farmers and growers were getting access to a reward for sequestration that some other non-levy payers wouldn't have access to, so lifestyle block owners or regional councils that also have similar types of sequestration. And so the Commission's advice was that sequestration should be rewarded through the emissions trading scheme, so it's more equitable, and that then it is rewarded in the same way as other forestry is at the moment in other categories. So to have a short-term interim option set up, because making changes to the emissions trading scheme takes a long time, we have proposed that there is a grant scheme set up using levy revenue that farmers can apply for to get short-term contractual payments for sequestration on farm. And we have proposed a difference to the types of vegetation that would be rewarded from the partnership. So the partnership recommended that both permanent categories of vegetation and cyclical categories of vegetation should be rewarded. And so a permanent category is obviously one that's permanent and or most likely to be permanent, and that can include things like regenerating indigenous bush. So if a farmer has a block of say maybe QE2 land or land that they have retired or that they've never farmed, that could be rewarded. If they have planted up an area, a hillside with woody vegetation, that could be classified as permanent, and some of that is already eligible. So if it has been planted since 1990, that could be eligible for the ETS already. But sometimes it's not eligible for the ETS, perhaps because it doesn't meet the size thresholds or the canopy cover thresholds of the ETS. And so there are some areas of land that farmers don't yet have access to the ETS for. And so that is the kind of vegetation that we want to be able to additionally reward. The partnership also wanted to reward cyclical categories of vegetation. So those are things that are may be pruned or cut down in a cyclical nature, such as shelter belts, orchards and vineyards, and maybe small woodlots that are used for firewood and things like that. And the government is recommending not to include those categories because it is administratively quite difficult to account for sequestration in those because of the changing nature of it, and also because they represent quite a small volume of sequestration relative to the administrative cost of accounting for it and rewarding farmers for it. So government has made a trade-off there that we want to try and reward sequestration where there's the greatest possible gain and benefit for both for farmers. So there are a number of details that would still need to be worked through in the sequestration proposal. and including the eligibility of areas of land to be rewarded, what the application process would look like for farmers to apply for these payments, how long those payments will carry on for, and what the terms and conditions of the contracts will be, as well as what the price will be. So the partnership proposed that sequestration will be rewarded at a price of 75 to 90% of the ETS price, whatever that might be that year. And so that's one option. I think another kind of quite technical but important point here is that the partnership did recommend that for some categories of vegetation, so of Indigenous regenerating bush, post 2008, that farmers would be rewarded for the full carbon stock change that happened. So what additional carbon is sequestered from an area of trees year by year. And government has recommended instead that we reward for the additional carbon that is sequestered through active management of areas of forest through fencing or pest control. And so we want to reward the what's called, the additional carbon that is sequestered because of that above business as usual. So that's a bit of a technical difference there, but it is quite material when it comes to determining what the rates of sequestration are that are happening that can then be rewarded. And so this is where you might have seen in the media that there's quite a bit of disappointment, I suppose, with where government has landed on sequestration. And so I think that's going to be quite an area of contention through the submission process. And then we thinking about, so obviously charging this levy on farmers' emissions is going to generate an amount of revenue. And some of that revenue will be used to pay for the operating costs of collecting the revenue, as is the case for government systems. And to do this, to set up the system to be able to collect revenue and measure emissions and the calculator and everything, it is quite it's quite a thing to have to set up. Much, and this is where one of the trade-offs was, there was a chance that it could be at a processor level price, and if it was at a processor level, there's about 80 processors that would be included that would need to pay that levy or that emissions price. But from the previous consultation that was done by the partnership back in February and March this year, farmers were very supportive of the emissions price happening at farm level. And so pricing at farm level means that we need a system that can gather revenue from 20 to 30,000 participants. And so, as you can imagine, that is quite a different system to be able to do that. And then the revenue will also go towards incentive payments, the sequestration payments in the short term, and there will also be an additional amount of revenue left over that government has agreed will be able to be recycled back to the sector to support further emissions reductions. And we are proposing that we work with the sector and with iwi Māori to determine how that money will be recycled, and that we will take advice and recommendations from the sector and Māori on that. So you will be aware that there's quite a bit of money already going into research and development to try and develop emissions reduction mitigation technologies, so things like vaccines and inhibitors, to try and support emissions reductions without having to reduce production. And so there is opportunity that some of this revenue will go into further supporting that R&D. So how will the price be set? This is another area of difference that government has from what the partnership proposed. So we have, I suppose, followed the advice from the Climate Commission, which recommended that the levy price needs to be set in an independent and transparent manner, and to have a little bit of separation from the sector in that area. So the partnership recommended that the sector would be involved in making recommendations about what the levy prices should be for both long-lived and short-lived emissions. So this is another area where there is likely to be some contention through the submission process, as it is an area where we differ from the partnership. So government is proposing that for long-lived gas emissions, that the price will be linked to the NZ ETS price, initially with a 95% discount. And so that mirrors what would have happened if agriculture went into the ETS, so that they would have gone into the ETS with a 95% discount to start with. And that 95% discount reflects a free allocation that that government provides to particular sectors who are trade exposed, so trading overseas, or emissions intensive industries. And so government reflects through policy that some sectors need support to be able to face that emissions price. And then for the methane price, we're proposing that it will be a unique price. And we want to adjust that price over time based on our progress towards meeting the methane target. Because we have that split gas target, we want to have split gas prices to enable us to respond to that. And we're proposing that the Minister for Agriculture and Minister for Climate Change will set those levy prices, but we will seek advice from the Climate Change Commission and consult with the sector and Māori to do that. And that aligns with, in some ways, the operations of the emissions trading scheme, where the Climate Commission provides advice to ministers year on year about the price settings for the emissions trading scheme. So we've also proposed some changes to how the governance of the system will work. So the partnership proposed that the sector and iwi would have quite a prominent role in the ongoing governance of the system, in part reflecting the way the kind of co-design of the system, and that would continue through into implementation. And so we've made some suggested changes there, and proposed a particular role for the sector and iwi around that revenue recycling role. And government will call on particular technical and scientific advisory panels or bodies for certain pieces of advice as and when necessary. So within the consultation documents that went out, there is a section, and it is what has been picked up in the media quite a bit as well, is that the putting a price on emissions is going to have potentially quite an impact on particularly the sheep and beef and deer sectors. And that is because from the modelling that we have done, there is quite a bit more variability in the profitability of the sheep and beef and deer sector, and that impacts their ability to pay for an emissions price and still maintain profitability and in the type of business that they have. And so this is a reflection of the role of emissions pricing, is that it puts a price on the pollution, and in a relatively blunt manner. That is what it's doing here, and because we have variability across our sectors, and because the sheep, beef and deer sectors have a lower level of revenue relative to their level of emissions, we are seeing that that is where the biggest impact is being felt. So we recognise this, and the Prime Minister made comments to this effect, that that we recognise that, as is the case in all emissions pricing, whether that's the ETS or otherwise, there are going to be particular sectors and communities that feel hit hardest. And we've seen that also up in Taranaki, with the closing down of some of the oil and gas exploration, is that we do need to think about how do we transition sectors or enable sectors to respond appropriately to emissions pricing. And this, in some ways, comes down to what the pathway will be for New Zealand towards a low emissions economy, and what agriculture will look like within that. And I think one of the big factors that came through in the modelling that we did is that when there are effective mitigation technologies, that has a real impact on the ability of farmers to be able to reduce emissions, and therefore reduce their emissions bill without having to reduce production or change land use. And so there are a number of different pathways that that this journey could still take. We know that some of the technology availability is still really uncertain, and what the pathway for that will look like, from research to uptake on farm. And so that's why government is investing in those technology pathways. But we do also need to think about what are the other transition pathways that may be necessary. And so to that point as well, the government has said that we do want to understand more through this consultation, given the uneven impact on some sectors, how can we ensure that there are equitable outcomes here? And so we are looking at ways across the whole system that we can ensure equity and equitable outcomes. And so we are also proposing that there will be some transitional support to sectors, communities, or particular farmers to support them face the price on their emissions. There is the role of incentive payments to support farmers to uptake particular technologies or practices to reduce their emissions. We have an ability to adjust the methane price along and how that could affect various sectors. We also propose in 2030 to do a review of how the emissions pricing system is working in practice. And there are a range of existing support and funding available for farmers to make changes on farm, or to be supported to make change. So I think I've covered transitional support, but that is definitely an area where we are still doing further policy work to look at how that could work. I'm just going to keep moving. So you'll see within the consultation, we are looking at two different options for pricing fertiliser. So the partnership recommended that fertiliser emissions be priced within the farm level levy. And the rationale was that they wanted all on-farm emissions to be priced in one system, and that farmers would have the most ability to be able to make change on farm to try and reduce their emissions bill through more efficient application of fertiliser. The Climate Commission recommended that fertiliser should be priced within the ETS, and that is in part because it would then, because fertilizer emissions are long-lived gases, so nitrous oxide, and so it would be seeking to align some of the long-lived gases with other long-lived gas priced in the ETS, and it would also reduce, in part, the number of farmers that would need to be priced, because for a lot of the horticulture and arable sector who don't have livestock, the fertilizer is the only emissions that they have. And so then it would mean that it would be less participants in the system. There will need to be an implementation agency set up to deliver this, and that's still a work in progress as well. And obviously, there will need to be a range of audit, verification and compliance systems that need to be set up as well, to ensure that there is enforcement of the price and that farmers are paying the right amount, and yeah, all of that stuff. So as I mentioned at the start, we are going to try really hard to ensure that farm level pricing is set up by 2025. But there is quite a lot to do. Even the partnership recognised that it would be challenging to get the system in place by 1 January 2025. And so as a backup, we will have a processor level levy that could be put in place if the farm level system is not set up in time. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. So I'm now, maybe we'll hand back to Joanna, but also just happy to go to any questions of clarification. And I can go back to particular slides if need be.
Right. Okay, if we can, if Marlene can help us flick back to the gallery view. Good. So, as I mentioned, we'll devote just the first few minutes of the question time to questions of clarification, and I wonder if I can have a gallery view so I can see hands going up. Can Marlene give us about a gallery view so we can see who has their hands up? Perhaps while that's happening, I'll ask you, Jessica, a question that is not a question of clarification, but a question that I'm curious about. Over the next few weeks, some of us in this gathering will be writing to the government as we send our submissions in on this topic. And I think we often speak of the government or the Crown and think of them as sort of grey officials processing documents, perhaps without the emotions that we put into our responses. And as a person who's currently part of the government working on this matter, what's it really like wrestling with this difficult, complex problem? What's it like for you, and what do you experience in other people on the team working on this?
Yeah, so I think, and I haven't been involved in a lot of government policy processes that have come up with things like this, but I can share, just a couple of insights. So I think this is quite a unique. This has been quite a unique process in that over the last 2 years, this policy has been co-designed with sector partners and with iwi Māori, and so it has been, I think, and I think it will be reflected on as hopefully quite a success in terms of the collaboration. I know we are still to get there in terms of landing something, hopefully, that the sector can still get behind, and I think that is really important. And and for Māori as well. But it has, you know, so it's really been a process of negotiation, and I think there wouldn't be too many people. I don't know if there's actually anyone who would be able to say that this has landed where they would have wanted it to. I think it is such a complex process to try and determine how to create a system that meets a whole range of principles, and so that is that it has to be effective in reducing emissions. It has to be equitable with other sectors that are already priced through the emissions trading scheme. And so there has to be some level of equity between how the energy sector and transport sector are being priced relative to the agriculture sector. And it has to be practical. So it has to be a system that can actually be implemented by, you know, within a period of time, and that farmers can interact and respond with. And there are definitely trade-offs across those principles, and there are, you know, even just across MFE, the Ministry for the Environment, and the Ministry for Primary Industries, there are different drivers there. You know, we are dealing with different ministers who have particular interests and ways that they want this to play out. So I think I think it has been a really unique process of trying to bring all of those aspects together, and the, you know, and all of the history that comes with this as well, where agriculture has you know, was going to go in the ETS and was out of the ETS, and so there's a lot of emotion in, you know, on this subject, and sometimes, you know, as a public servant, not sometimes, all of the time, we are there to represent and work on behalf of the elected ministers and the government of the day, and it is our role to deliver on their objectives and to turn it into something that is workable. So yeah, so it has been, yeah, a very interesting process, and I do think that there still is, you know, that's why we're doing this consultation. I think there is scope for it to be further improved and enhanced in response to the consultation and the feedback that we get, because, as I said at the start, this is such a new policy area to try and design a system like this. And so I think there is real need for the government to continue to hear feedback, this time about the nuts and bolts of the system. I think previous consultations have been focused on whether agriculture should be priced, and should it be in the ETS or an alternative system, and now we really have the design detail of how that alternative could work. And unfortunately, there is still a next stage, which will be actually putting in place the regulations, which will be things like another round of consultation on exactly what the price will be, or what mitigation technology will be rewarded. And so getting into that final level of detail again.
It sounds extremely intense. But I guess when you think that the ramifications of our doing this may have impact elsewhere in the world on other nations' agriculture systems, it's kind of worth the burden that you and your teammates bear. Marlene, is it possible to get a full screen view of everyone so that we can see hands going up?
Yeah, I mean, on my screen it's good. Had some exchange, so I wonder if there are many people who don't have the gallery view.
If you usually there's a button on the top right that says view, and you can click on that to choose your own view to set it to gallery. So
yeah, so everybody has to put gallery. Yeah, I think that's
has to set it themselves.
Thanks
for the advice.
Okay. All right, so now open for questions of clarification. Are there, was that David Eyre and also Joyce Wiley? David, was your hand up first? No, okay, Joyce Wiley.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks everybody for that. As farmers, we're quite submissioned out, Jessica, and you've sort of said that the ministers already have a fairly good idea on what they want. What's the point? You know, we've been wrestling with this for years as farmers, and we've been to meeting after meeting with Waka Eke Noa and federated farmers and beef and lamb and all the rest of it. I suspect you've got two ministers that are, at least two, that are quite firm in what they're already going to do. So that November the 18th, we've got to make submissions. As a cynic, I wonder how much listening is going on. Any comments?
Yeah, no, I think in some ways I have a lot of sympathy for you, and I think especially since Waka Eke Noa did go out and consult on this already this year, there is yeah, I think, and especially because it's not just for farmers, it's not just this issue that is happening at the moment. It's also freshwater farm plans, it's forestry in the ETS, it's biodiversity stuff going on. There is a lot happening in the environment space for farmers at the moment, intensive winter grazing, all of these things, and I think it is, you know, it is in part because the government has an ambitious profile of things that they want to get done in this term of government. It is an election next year, and so there is, you know, in 3-year government cycles, there's actually a limited amount of time where you can actually really get policy change happening to be able to go through all of this process. What would my advice be? I think that there are key areas where, especially where the government's proposal differs from the partnership's proposal, where ministers will be particularly interested in feedback, and because these are things that that the partnership hadn't consulted on in detail, and it is, you know, it's difficult. I again sympathize that there is a lot of technical detail to try and get your head around, to then be able to say, okay, what's my opinion on this and how do I provide a submission back to government on it, and so I can only think, like, from a farmer's point of view, at least in making a submission, to think about like what it would mean for you. And if there was an emissions price in the way that is proposed, or if there was sequestration in the way that is proposed. So thinking about things like what technology options are available for me at the moment for me to try and reduce my emissions, and letting ministers know, or letting us know about how limited or available those are. What would you actually do on farm if you faced an emissions price, and just sort of thinking about, because I think some of the things like that you can't just, you know, providing feedback on things like, you can't just reduce your stock numbers by 20%, because then how is that going to flow into the rest of your farm system? Thinking about, you know, what are the options for you for sequestration if you could be rewarded for additional sequestration from riparian margins or regenerating indigenous plantations on farm. So, like, what could that incentivize you to do? Is there opportunity that you would retire some land and perhaps plant it in natives if you were rewarded at a particular rate to be able to be supported to do that?
Thank you. Thank you. It's probably helpful if people use the little reactions button to raise your hand. Thus, it's easier to see that way. So I will just scan the screens. Thomas Powell, go for it.
I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit more on why Waka Eke Noa didn't adopt a market-based system, you know, an allotment and more of a purely market-based ETS, which is kind of more the common type of cap and trade, which would have cost them less. I mean, it would have been a more economic than paying a levy if they were just paying each other. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so you might have seen that there was some media commentary as well about the option that Minister Shaw had put forward, which was for a cap and trade system, and that was one of the options that was put forward as an option by the Climate Change Commission early on in the 2019 report, when they were looking at different ways for pricing. And so that would be similar to the emissions trading scheme, which has a fixed cap of units that are allocated in that scheme, and they can be reduced over time, so that government has some handle on what the total quantum of emissions that can be traded are. And so there was a proposal that could be done for agricultural emissions as well, particularly given that we do face this gross emission reduction target for agricultural emissions. And so it was looked at by the partnership and not decided to go ahead with, because partly to carry out that kind of system, there has to be a baseline or an allocation method for how farmers can be allocated their initial kind of emissions allocation that then they can trade up or down from that amount. And the sector have recommended against that because of equity issues, and partly that is around early adopters. So for those who have maybe already reduced their emissions or taken practices on farm that have reduced their emissions, they might not have any more ability to reduce further. And the other challenge with such a cap and trade system, and you could only do it for methane, there would still be a need to price long-lived gases, probably within the emissions trading scheme, is that when you seek to have a cap and trade system, again, it would be the more profitable sectors will be those that can pay more for methane units if they were to be traded. And so there was equity issues there, again, that the sector felt they weren't able to overcome. And so in the end, that wasn't put forward as an option. Minister Shaw was still keen for it to be considered as an option, but at this point in time, because of the need to have an allocation system, it can't be implemented by 2025.
Thank you, Jessica. Let me say that questions are open now for any questions that people would like to ask. And David Bartle, over to you.
What a brilliant speaker. Thank you. You know everything on this topic. And I wanted to just ask about the international implications. You mentioned earlier about your meeting at the OECD and how other countries are starting to work on this. And obviously a lot of farmers feel that they're unfairly being treated because New Zealand is ahead of the game. And there's always a problem on all of these sorts of things of so-called free riders. And we can never stop that. But what's your sense of how we could use this New Zealand initiative to get others around the planet on board?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think in part it is kind of, it's on New Zealand really to have to lead the way on this, because of our because of the greater proportion of agricultural emissions within our emissions profile, because it is 50% of our emissions, and so it is very difficult for us to ignore it. But for other countries where perhaps the methane in the agriculture sector is less of a proportion of their emissions, they can not ignore it, but they can focus on other sources of emissions reductions in the short term. And something that we know here in New Zealand and elsewhere, the cost of abatement, so the cost either through technology or through lost production from agriculture to reduce emissions, is really expensive. Some of the highest cost emissions reductions, and that is why it is it's so difficult, and it's partly why what is a big part of why you will be able to see in the consultation material that if we actually put it in the ETS, the impact will be so much greater on the agriculture sector, because once you price methane at the equivalent price of long-lived gases, it just makes the emissions price far too high for farmers to really be able to absorb. And because there aren't the mitigation technologies available as there are in other sectors to be able to cost effectively reduce emissions. And so at the moment, for other sectors, for other countries, other sectors in other countries, they can reduce emissions at a lower cost and respond that way. But at some point, once other countries have reduced those emissions in their other sectors, they will then face still the challenge of methane and how to reduce agricultural emissions. And I think and also more and more other countries are recognizing the importance to reduce methane emissions because of the greater warming impact that they have in the short term. And there are now more international agreements and attention and action focused on reducing methane emissions. And so it's and again, the easier ones and the ones that people are going to focus on is those that come from the fossil sectors. So methane from oil and gas is also a source, and so people will look to reduce that first, but then still there will be a need to reduce methane from the agriculture sector. And I think in some ways, because New Zealand has recognised this and has this large agriculture emissions methane challenge, that is why we have invested heavily in technology for vaccines or inhibitors to try and overcome this. And so I think once we put a price on emissions as well, it will further incentivize greater investment in this area by both the sector and government. And so hopefully we find some solution there that then will be relevant sectors overseas as well.
Thank you. Fiona Edie, please ask your question.
Thanks, Joanna, and thanks, Jessica, for a really interesting and informative talk. You kind of helped me get my head around this a bit. I've got a couple of questions kind of related to the financial side of it that are related to each other. So for an average farmer, whatever that may look like, in the different sectors, how much of a cost imposition is this? Is this 1% on what they would be on their profitability, or 10% or 50%? And if it's at that higher end, then it's going to end up having to be captured somewhere. And so is this going to push food prices up? And if that happens, for people who are already struggling with being able to afford quality food, how is the government proposing to kind of mitigate that impact across the wider society?
Yeah, good question. So there has been, and it's not included in our in some of the stuff we've released, but we have also looked into case studies for how much this could cost farmers, and it is and I think the partnership has provided, there will be on their website as well, some case studies based on similar prices that we've modeled as well for how it could look. And obviously farming throughout New Zealand is very variable, and no farm is the same, and so there is quite a big difference in what it could cost farmers, but it's sort of in the range, and I don't have it in terms of like a percentage of their profit, but there is, you know, there is quite a wide range for how much it could cost per hectare. And again, this depends on what the eventual price could be. So on the prices that we modeled, I think it was, you know, there was a range of between like perhaps $10 per hectare up to sort of $50 or $60 per hectare for some farms, depending on how intensive versus extensive they are. And so there is a bit of a range there. And again, it depends on what the final prices will be. I don't think the prices that we modeled, I don't know the extent to which they will be, what the prices end up being. We know at least that the ETS price is going to change between now and 2025. And on the food prices issue, there are, whilst in consideration of setting the price, definitely achieving our emissions reduction targets is kind of the first priority, as there is for other government policy as well. There's also the socioeconomic issues that government has to consider when setting these sorts of prices. And I think you know, something that will be really critical to this is what is the pace and scale of change that has to happen. Like how fast do we need to move to and how does the price then reflect that? So I think that will be where government will be watching kind of year on year what the response is to the emissions price, and then how that needs to change up or down.
Thank you. Michael Burton.
Yeah, kia ora, Jessica. That was a phenomenally interesting thing, but I've got a sort of an existential argument, I guess, that I'm interested in your view on, in that growing food is, and we'll come to the types of food that we grow a little bit further in the question, but growing food is sort of fundamental to human existence, as opposed to a lot of the other things that we create emissions for that might be considered Western lifestyle luxuries. It would be better to treat food production in a different way, and we perhaps are a little bit with what's proposed here, and get some focus on trying to reduce emission, well, a world agreement on creating carbon emissions for the things that are important, like food production. In terms of food production, there seems to be a lot of evidence that shifting towards plant-based food alternatives is far more efficient in terms of carbon neutrality than dairy or sheep and beef. But I guess the question I'm interested in is, has the government looked at the sort of the food necessity argument in terms of its emission trading scheme for agriculture versus the rest of the economy, or is it trying to treat food or agricultural production systems in a very similar way to the rest of the economy?
Yeah, I think definitely the government acknowledges the unique situation of the agriculture sector, both from a food production point of view, and also you know, of its importance to the economy, and the unique kind of profile of the emissions that come from that, and the ability. I think the reason why agriculture hasn't been priced over the last 20 years is that you know, we have been waiting for technology options to come along and hopefully, you know, enable us to keep producing without or reduce emissions without having to have too much of an impact on production. And I think we've come up against time now where the government is saying, okay, we have committed to price agricultural emissions by 2025, and we're going to do that. And so now it's a matter of how do we design a pricing system that will incentivize the right things to happen on farm that minimizes that impact on production. And I think in some ways it is the nature, through putting a price on emissions, you are, from a purely kind of economic theoretical point of view, you are saying there is a cost to society from that. And we know that there is a cost to society from methane emissions, even though there is, there are these arguments around the fact that there have been livestock and cows in New Zealand for a long time. They are still producing, every tonne of methane that we have is still contributing to warming. And so there has been a decision that we want to put a price on that, and that price will then incentivize behavior change. And so it could be for some that then incentivizes a reduction in their stock numbers, or it could be that they can intensify production, so trying to produce more from the same amount of animals. And be more efficient in their production systems in that way, or they could seek to diversify their farming systems. And I think that's a question for New Zealand about what are the alternative farming systems that are available for farmers if they want to transition to a different type of land use. Obviously, at the moment, the issue that everybody is familiar with is at the moment the most economic alternative for many, especially for sheep and beef farmers, is exotic pine forestry, and so that's obviously, it's not food production, and so that is a bit of a challenge when we are up against what to do with our land systems when there is one kind of source that is returning quite a strong economic incentive at the moment relative to other land uses, including food production from either livestock or plant-based systems. So I think that is, obviously if we're looking for diversification and alternative land uses, that requires supply chains and industry and agribusiness to be able to support that to happen as well.
Thank you, Jessica. We'll honor the two people who had their hand up, but I'll ask you to try to make your questions pretty succinct and the answers pretty succinct. So Joyce, go for it.
It was just a comment when somebody asked about the economics. Like our place, it's going to cost us $10,000 for 1,000 hectare extensive sheep and beef farm, and we can't plant trees because we're in an outstanding natural landscape. So we have limited bulb options in sequestration. We have got a lot of native bush, which we would like to see counted. At the moment, it's not eligible. So that would be important to us, that the emissions would be balanced out with abilities to sequester. So, yep, that's just a comment. Thanks, Joanne.
Thanks, Joyce. That was helpful. Thomas, last question.
Hi, thank you. How do regenerative farms and organic farms, how do they sit with this? Are they going to be benefited by it, or are they going to be penalized by it?
Yeah, so and that is something I have thought a bit about as well, is that the difference that the system has for intensive versus extensive systems, and it is one of the challenges of looking at a farming system through one lens, which is about reducing emissions. And obviously the environment has considerations of climate and water and soils and animal welfare and health and all of these things that need to be considered. And so here we are dealing with just one tool in the toolkit of how to create sustainable land use systems. And so there is, there are many complexities and trade-offs within the system, and so one of those is about that if you are to farm in a particular way, so a big part of your emissions is related to total feed intake, and so that there are ways that you can increase total feed intake, which then speed up the way that you can fatten animals and get them off farm quicker, and so that will reduce your emissions, both because so if you're eating higher quality feed, and that could include supplementary feed as well. So for a lot of dairy farmers, for example, if they're bringing in feed from off farm, they're able to feed their animals and then produce more milk. And so that intensive system in some ways is better from an emissions perspective, and that is what New Zealand does in many respects quite well, even from the pastoral systems that we're really good at converting pasture grown into product outputs. So we have a pretty efficient system. But if you were shifting to a more extensive system that perhaps wasn't as intensive in terms of feed efficiency, then you have animals that are taking longer to fatten, for example, and then your actual emissions might be higher per unit of product, and so there is an emissions intensity issue in this as well. But to be able to capture the information on emissions intensity, it requires a lot of data, and so so that's a challenge. On the organic and regenerative side, obviously we are going to be charging a price on nitrogen fertilizer. So if you are not using nitrogen fertilizer on your property, then you're not going to be charged for that. And so that is one way that farmers also can increase their output, but it also increases their emissions from that additional emissions as well. So so there are, again, in some ways you might be winning from having an organic system, and in some ways there will be trade-offs to that as well. Sorry, Joanna, I know that was not a very succinct answer. My brain's getting a bit tired.
Well, it's a good time to end, but I think my impression hearing you answer that question is just a re-emphasis of how exceedingly complex this is, and thank goodness we have fine brains like yours and your teams applied to it. So Jessica, thank you very much for walking us through this really, really complex matter, but super important matter, and helping us clarify our minds on this. And I just want to thank you for your dedicated work on it, trying to create the right balance between what's right for the climate, which is paramount, and what's going to be politically acceptable, and what's going to not strain the lives of farmers too badly. Just thanks for doing it. I want to also thank Marlene for her technical work, supporting these online huis. This meeting has been recorded, as you will know, and will be available soon on our website. So if you want to go over some of the complexity, you'll have a second chance. We actually find that our informational hui attract quite a huge viewership in the thousands. So I think this one will probably attract many people. Regarding the submission to the consultation on reducing agricultural emissions that's going from the forum, David Eyre, David Bartle and I have been working on this over the last week to produce a draft of a forum submission on this matter, and we hope to send it to all charter signatories in the forum in the next few days to encourage your comments on this first draft. And if you're not yet a charter signatory, hurry to the website and become one, and you'll get your chance to comment on the first draft. I want to encourage you to come to our next hui, which will be face-to-face with lunch on December the 3rd at Meadowbanks in Stoke. And at this hui, we'll review our last year, do some strategic thinking, select our next leadership group, and spend a little time collecting our ideas on a positive vision of our future, and include the agriculture, so how we produce our food in the future. Okay, a closing karakia, and I'll turn to the one that I often use with the imagery of we've been in our waka and paddling together to reach our goals, and we've come to the shore, and we're pausing to look at where we've come from and where we're going. Ko te hā, ko te pō, ko tangaroa, ko te mana, ko te kotahitanga o ngā mata waka. Haumi e, hui e, taiki e.